Four lessons I learned about Alzheimer's caregiving. I learned that people living with Alzheimer's or related dementia are not the enemy. They are our loved ones. My name is Bob DeMarco. I was an Alzheimer's caregiver. I took care of my mother for 8.5 years. 3,112 days, actually. I took care of her until the day she went to heaven. If you are a caregiver, I know how you feel. I understand how you might be feeling each day. I understand that because I lived it myself. Okay, let's get started. As it turned out for us, it was a long and arduous journey. A journey that started with fear, burden, and heartbreak, and ended with feelings of great accomplishment and joy. Caring for my mother in her greatest time of need was the greatest accomplishment of my life. I'm going to repeat that. Caring for my mother in her greatest time of need was the greatest accomplishment of my life. I know other caregivers come to the same conclusion over time. Lesson number one. One of the things I learned in my battle with Alzheimer's was caregivers often feel angry, frustrated, and agitated during the day. I wish our relatives and friends could better understand this, better understand how we might be feeling. I wrote, sitting in the front row with Alzheimer's, not only for persons caring for someone living with dementia, but also for their families and friends to read. You might consider sharing this so everyone can better understand what it is like being one of us. You can find a link to Sitting in the Front Row with Alzheimer's in the show notes below this podcast. Lesson number two. I learned that a person you know all or most of your life suddenly changes. This makes communication very difficult. As a result of this, you have to learn new and different ways to understand, cope, and communicate with them. This person, your loved one, begins to act out behaviors that you never saw or experienced before. In the early stage of Alzheimer's, meanness and nonsensical behaviors are hard to accept. We have trouble accepting those behaviors because the person is acting differently than they've acted over the course of their life. We have trouble accepting them and dealing with them, the changes. In the beginning, you want to scream or cry. This is the typical reaction when a caregiver first starts caring for a person living with Alzheimer's. Please note, Alzheimer's patients are rarely intentionally mean. More likely they are confused. Never forget, they are the person living with dementia, and they are also trying to deal with this new and horrific change that they cannot understand. Think about how they feel. Give it some thought. I've written 2 articles around these issues. The first, this is not the person I knew, and the second is Alzheimer's care. 3 little words that work. You can find the links in the show notes. Lesson number 3. I learned how difficult it can be to separate out the causes of the disease from the person living with the disease. We tend to blame the deeply forgetful. I'm referring to the person living with dementia here. We tend to blame the deeply forgetful for their actions instead of trying to understand the causes of Alzheimer's and how Alzheimer's causes these often hard to understand difficult behaviors. I learned that one of the most difficult things you will ever have to do as an Alzheimer's caregiver is separate out the disease from the person. I wrote an article to help other caregivers understand this that is entitled Communicating in Alzheimer's World. It is very difficult to separate the person living with Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease itself into 2 distinct parts. I learned and realized that a person living with Alzheimer's or related dementia is our loved one, not the enemy. I'm going to repeat it. They're our loved one, not the enemy. Keep this in mind. I don't want to give the impression that any of this was easy. We had to adapt and make changes as the disease progressed. You'll have to do that. For example, when I took my mother out to dinner at a nice restaurant, she wouldn't say a word for 45 minutes or longer. I suppose she was intimidated or disconcerted by this new unfamiliar environment. By the time we arrived back home, I had a stomach ache. The behavior was breaking my heart and it was hurting my stomach. How did I adapt? I started taking her to smaller, more relaxed restaurants. We would often sit at a bar and eat. Guess what happened? My mother started holding conversations with the other people sitting around the bar. People even came up to her and started talking to her. Most of those people that came up were women, and they were talking to my mom, who at the time was in her 90s. Here's another important thing that happened. I realized people really liked my mom. Alzheimer's patients are often sweet, nice, and kind when we put them in the right environments. Lesson number 4. I finally realized that I needed to analyze my mother's new patterns of behavior. My mother's patterns of behavior. I started looking very closely at the good versus the bad. I thought about each problem one by one. I thought I might be able to discover a solution and change these bad patterns. I did it. Why was my mother like this and what could I do about it? I wrote a very good article entitled Changing Patterns of Behavior in an Alzheimer's Patient. I strongly suggest you read that. The link is below. Instead of making it all about me, I started making it all about my mom. This worked much better. This was a lesson well learned. This realization allowed us to start living our life again. It brought with it several additional unexpected benefits. Exercise, socialization, bright light. The list is long. I've written about all of these, and they helped improve our daily living. Each learning experience led to my own metamorphosis as a caregiver. I learned how to accept that what my mother was doing was normal to her. These crazy behaviors are normal to Alzheimer's patients. Think about that. You have to accept it. What I did not accept was that it had to remain that way. After all, Dottie was my mother, not the enemy. I am going to suggest that you read my article, Alzheimer's Care, The Power of Purpose in Our Lives. Look for the link below in the show notes. My name is Bob DeMarco. The Alzheimer's Reading Room operates for the benefit of society. Simply put, we help caregivers and their loved one living with dementia to live a better life. I know you can do it because I did it myself. See you all next time. Thanks for listening.